Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center and the Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled, Help Me to Find My People. We're joined by past fellow and professor of history of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, Heather Williams. Today is April 6, 2021. Welcome, everyone. This is Andy Mink, a voice you should recognize by now. I'm the Vice President of Education at the Center, and as I always do, I want to welcome you to tonight's episode on behalf of my staff, Libby and Mike, as well as our graduate interns, Hannah and Carly and Josh. Like many of you, we are working largely from a remote distance of the center, but we're very pleased that you're able to join us, whether you are teaching face-to-face or perhaps in a hybrid model of some kind yourself. In particular, I want to welcome Vivian, who's here tonight from Broadway Elementary School. It's always great to have elementary school teachers with us, really developing that foundation of content and approach to the humanities disciplines. Maureen's joining us tonight from Pamlico County here in the great state of North Carolina. Andreas is joining us from Puerto Rico. Sonia from New York City. Joanna adds that she's from northern Alaska, which to me sounds a little bit repetitive. Everything about Alaska sounds pretty far north. Joanna, thank you for joining us. And on the other side of the world, Lisa's down in Southwest Florida. I also want to thank our university folks for joining us. Eugenia, it's great to see you again. She's joining us from Nashville at Vanderbilt University, and Marlena is at the University of Maryland. The National Humanities Center is kind of moving through the academic cycle the same way that all of you are. That is to say, it's sunny, there's a lot of pollen out. Our fellows are frantically working towards the end of their fellowship year. They're worried about returning their library books. They're trying to tie up all the last research questions that they've posed themselves and the conversations that they've begun. And in some ways, I think that, what I hope tonight's session brings to you is to make that process a little visible. Historians, philosophers, literary scholars, geographers, every humanities discipline has its own approach to the tools of its trade. And for the historian, like Professor Williams, there's a very specific way to approach and assemble the past, reassemble the past through evidentiary argument, through primary source documents, and to try to really understand the narrative of our human condition the best way that we can. And I hope you do ask questions and try to make sense a little bit more in your own mind about making visible that process of thinking like an historian, of being an historian, of understanding that the work of history is a verb. It's an action verb. It's something that you engage in and interrogate as opposed to simply being told facts that you recite back. I do want to make sure that you do visit and use the Humanities in Class Digital Library as a support for tonight's session and all of your curricular work. Be sure that you sign up for the group titled Humanities in Class Webinar Series. This is where you'll find all of the materials that we'll share with you tonight. That includes any pre-readings and resources that Professor Williams has put forward, as well as some other materials that have been curated that connect this work with the classroom. Be sure to take a look at those before the sessions if you can, but listen, guess what? You guys are working hard right now, so it may be that you reflect on tonight's session by using these resources. This is also where we'll add the recording of tonight's session, and again, we like to edit them so that there are multiple shorter chunks of tonight's episode rather than just the one long 90-minute session. Take a look in the library as well on the digital shelves for other materials that are related to tonight's topic and tonight's theme. If you do so, you'll find a lot of material created at the National Humanities Center, whether those are lessons or analysis tools or ways to approach the subject. It may also be materials that we've used in previous webinars, things that you can pull together and use for your teaching regardless of the grade that you work in. I would encourage you to use the keywords that emerged tonight to go back into the library and find these free, openly licensed resources that are from not only the National Humanities Center, but over 80 of our content partners in all disciplines across the country. One of you asked me a moment ago, Kelly, I think, asked me how many sessions we have left. It's hard to believe that we have only 7 sessions left. So after tonight, there'll be 7 more webinars. Of course, each of these earns you 5 professional development credit hours. Yes, to my Los Angeles community, that does translate to salary points. And I would encourage you to go back and take a look at the remaining sessions and sign up for any that you might be interested in but haven't had a chance to actually register for yet. I'd also encourage you to take a look at our online courses. These are designed to be roughly the same amount of work, but to really immerse you in a single topic. So for about 5 hours of work per week over a 5-week span, you earn 35 credit hours. And I think, to me, this is a really great way to spend time with scholars and scholarship and primary source archives to explore these kinds of compelling topics. I want to invite all of you to consider applying for the 2021-22 Teachers Advisory Council. I'm so pleased to be able to work with these talented and dedicated educators, folks like Wendy Harris, who's in the room tonight, and Ginger Park, who's now been a part of our cohort for 2 cycles. It's really been important for us to be able to connect with and gain the expertise and the authority of these classroom educators. The application process is not burdensome, but we do require that you get a letter of support from your supervisor. As I've said before, that's not for us to check on you necessarily. It's to alert your administration that we will be bringing you to North Carolina in the fall, and we don't want them to push back when you ask for that substitute. We're taking applications until May the 3rd, and I would love to have many of you consider applying and being a part of that cohort. Tonight's session, when we begin in a moment, will be an audio and PowerPoint only webinar, but your participation is super important. If you take a look where the 3 red arrow is, you'll see that there are 2 different tabs. One is for the audience chat. That's a way for you to chatter at each other and share resources and sort of get to know each other as best you can. It's also just above it a tab where you can submit formal questions for Professor Williams to consider. And as the moderator, I'll bring those forward when the time is right, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions that you might have. If you have any kind of technical problems tonight, please don't hesitate to refresh your screen or even log out and come back in. This will not disrupt your documentation of attendance, so don't worry about that. But usually, I hate to say it's so easy, but usually that will kickstart any audio or lag that you might be experiencing. Again, I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this session titled, Help Me to Find My People. I'm extremely pleased to be joined again, actually, by Heather Williams. She's the Geraldine R. Siegel Professorship in American Social Thought and Professor of Africana Studies. Her business card is larger than her backpack. She's currently at the University of Pennsylvania, and maybe as importantly, she was a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 2007 and 8. I also want to welcome to our work tonight our TA, Alicia Butler, is joining us from McKinley Technology High School in Washington, D.C. Alicia is part of our Teacher Advisory Council, and she's going to be dropping links and questions and general thoughts in the audience chat as we move forward. So that's my introduction, Heather. I so much appreciate you joining us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Libby.
Wait a minute, Heather. You sound to me like your feet are up and you are getting ready to engage in material that you know really well. And
are on the ground. Thank you very much.
And you're going to share primary source documents with us that are very meaningful for you. My opening question to the teachers was to share how they approach those. If you don't mind, tell us before we get started. This is just a personal side note. You're an historian. You've been a sleuth for a long time. Mm-hmm. Has there been a single primary source document or artifact or material culture where you found it, you discovered it, and it just blew your mind? It was a Shazam moment. Have you had one of those experiences?
I've had a few, and actually 2 of them are in this presentation.
Well, you know what? If you're going to share that with us, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think that sensation that I think you're describing or will describe is exactly what younger people will find when you introduce these kinds of artifacts to them. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful electric feeling when you start to put your hands and your mind around the past. So Heather, I'm going to turn the PowerPoint over to you and invite you to share this story with us.
Okay, so what do I do? Press next?
You do. So you can go down to the slide 16, just go down and it'll advance the slides for you.
Okay. All right. Well, again, good evening, everybody. Um, we're talking mostly about family separation tonight, forced separation of African American families. But I wanted to begin with just setting a little bit of context for the environment in which these separations took place. And this first part, really, we could do 2 hours on it, and so I won't get too embedded in it. But a very important statute for us was passed in Virginia in 1662. And I'll just say that many of you have probably heard this or read this, that historians of the very early period in America have kind of come to a consensus for now. You know, people are always finding new material. That in the very beginning, so Africans landed in Virginia in 1619. There had been people in Florida, La Florida. But so 1619 is sort of the point at which we see Africans in the English colonies. And the belief is that at the very beginning, they were not fully enslaved, that some of them may have occupied a status as indentured servants, as did Europeans, some poor Europeans. But over time, over a fairly short time, the colonists in Virginia started to make them into slaves, to enslave them. And so 1640 is a really important date where, and again, I can't go into a lot of detail, but this is a time when John Punch, African-American man, was working on a tobacco farm with white servants. He ran away with 2 of them. They were caught in Maryland, returned, taken to court, and the court extended the term of service. So they were all indentured servants. They were serving a period of years, not a lifetime. And they extended the service of the white men, and they basically sentenced John Punch to life as a servant, as a slave. And so that's a very important marker. 1660, you see white servants being punished for running away with enslaved people, because now with black people, because now the black people were enslaved. And so you could not extend the time for their having run away. So you extended the white servant's time as punishment for that servant running away, and then extended it again for having run away with somebody whose time couldn't be extended. So what you see is a piling on for those white servants who had run off with black people. And as you can imagine, that kind of punishment would then likely discourage black and white people from acting together. And that was also a benefit to the colonists, who did not want, most of the people in the laborers in the Virginia colony early on were white, and you don't want them sort of bonding with black people and then having more power in that sense. And then for us, the 1662 statute that I have here, which says Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. And one of the things that we can talk about at some point, maybe have a discussion about the use of language, you know, because if I show this slide in class and I ask a student to read it, which is what I normally would do, because for me, that just adds energy to the classroom so that I'm not doing all the talking. And so I've had students just really hesitate to use that word Negro, and we have to talk about it and so on. And in the writing, you know, you use it if it's in quotation marks, if it's from a text that you're working with. So this statute says there have been some questions, you know, about whether when a black woman, a Negro woman, has a child with an Englishman, what will the status of that child be? And they say, let's just really clarify this once and for all. That child will follow the condition of the mother. So if the mother is enslaved, that child will be a slave for life. And so by 1662, a lot of the Black people were enslaved. And this kind of veered from what would have happened under normal circumstances and under English common law, where the child would have followed the status of the father. And they want to make sure that people understand that even if the child's father is the owner of a huge plantation, even if the child's father later on is Thomas Jefferson, that child follows the status of the mother. They want to be clear about who is owned and about who owns whom, so that if a woman, let's say a Black woman had a child with a Black man, an enslaved man, they're both enslaved, but that man belongs to somebody else, and that frequently happens. There's no fighting over who owns that child. The father's owner does not have any ownership right in that child. That child belongs to the owner of the mother. So this is one of the first sort of statements about Black families and about children and offspring and how people would be treated. And just to follow on that a little bit, 1667, Virginia again says being baptized, becoming a Christian, claiming that you're a Christian does not exempt you from slavery, even though as English people we had said we do not enslave Christians. But if you are somebody who's been marked as somebody who can be a slave in America, which means you're Black, and in some colonies you're Indian for a while, and baptism will not save you from slavery. And then finally, in 1669, I say finally for my purposes tonight, but it's not the end of these kinds of statutes. 1669, Virginia says that killing your slave while punishing that slave will not be deemed murder because, number one, only through violence can you correct or punish an enslaved person, because you can no longer use the mode that had been available or was available for servants. Again, extending time, you can no longer do that. So it's physical violence that's going to be used. And if in the act of punishment, of punishing somebody, you kill that person, we're not going to consider that murder, because murder requires intent. And we don't think that owners would intend to kill their slaves. They say he would not destroy his own estate. And so, and that changes over time in Virginia. It barely changes in South Carolina, for instance. And something that's important is that these statutes that Virginia enacted did not stay only in Virginia. They traveled all over the South, really. And by 1705, Virginia then had a full-blown slave code. So what I've done here, you see this year, 3 years later, there's another statute, then there's another statute, then there's another statute. And by 1705, they're unrolling a full slave code, and they're becoming much more reliant on the labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans. So that's just a very quick contextualizing, at least the beginnings of slavery. And I'm working on a project now on violence in the South, and I've spent the last probably 3 or 4 months just immersed in legislation from across time and across states and colonies. And it is remarkable. I mean, I hope my book is not going to be too boring, because I want people to see the language of the legislation and the kinds of concerns that legislators, white elites in these colonies and states, the kinds of concerns they had and that they were trying to address through the laws. So I'm going to go down this gets us to the separation topic for the evening. And I will kind of just take you into my process, because I think, as Andy said, it's hard for me to separate what I've learned from my process of learning and my process of questioning and the kinds of questions that I've had of the material. So this first slide is titled Information Wanted. It's an ad that was placed in a newspaper, an African-American newspaper, published in 1866. So the Civil War ended in 1865. You get the 13th Amendment passed, saying there's no more slavery unless you're a prisoner, in December of 1865. In 1866, there's a black newspaper being published in, I think it was, is it Nashville? I think Nashville, Tennessee. And that's a whole other topic of what Black people were doing in terms of literacy and kind of written communication right after the Civil War ended. So this ad says, information is wanted of my mother, whom I left in Fauquier County, Virginia in 1844, and I was sold in Richmond, Virginia to Samuel Copeland. I formerly belonged to Robert Rogers. I am very anxious to hear from my mother, and any information in relation to her whereabouts will be very thankfully received. My mother's name was Betty and was sold by Colonel Briggs to James French, and is asking for information to be sent to the newspaper. I started to come across ads like these in Black newspapers while I was working on my dissertation, which was on African American education during slavery and during I prefer to say the emancipation period, but that's part of the Reconstruction period. And I had questions about what Black people thought of education, literacy specifically, but in broader terms as well. And one of the sources I sought out was newspapers. And so I would go to these Black newspapers to see if they were advertising books, if there were articles about schools, if there were notices of schools opening, that kind of thing. And I started to see these ads, and I had read about them in Leon Litwack's book, Been in the Storm So Long, but I had never seen them as they appeared in the newspapers. And I was reading them on microfilm. And the great thing about microfilm is that it would show you, just as newspapers.com does now, it would show you the full page, the full newspaper, not just, it's not that somebody had just gone in and typed up what was there, or, the computer kind of digitized it. You get the full paper. And so you see the articles, you see the ads for different kinds of medicines and treatments, clothing, hoop skirts, and so on. And then you see these ads. And sometimes there would be one on a page. So after a while, I started to learn where to go in the newspaper to look for it. Or there might be 5 or 6 or 10 on a page, depending. The Christian Recorder is a newspaper that had been published by the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia for years before slavery ended. And those papers were circulating in the South and the North after the war. And a lot of people placed ads in the papers. And so in the Christian Recorder, you might see 10 in a weekly issue or even more. And I found them so poignant and so compelling. I mean, I was moved pretty much to tears when I saw the first ones. And that summer, I was in graduate school, and I was still working on my dissertation research, but I also started looking for these ads. And by the end of the summer, I collected about 400 of them. Over the course of years, I found over 1,000, and especially since the book came out, people have been doing more and more research, and I don't know what the number is up to right now. So I found these and I started collecting them. And at first I thought I would publish them as a primary source, just, just, these ads. And then eventually I thought, no, this will be my second book. And so I finished the dissertation, I finished that book, self-taught, and then tried to figure out how to tell this, what's the story here, It's very concise. There are some ads that are longer than this, but many of them are this length, about roughly. And so you've got Thornton Copeland. I don't know his age, but he's telling us that he had been separated from his mother for 22 years and that he was still hoping that he could find her. And that, I think, the fact of the separation happening in the first place, and then the fact that somebody had hope of finding his mother after all those years, I think those were the things that struck me and that were compelling to me and that spoke to me about emotions. He said his mother's name was Betty, and that's very significant. He doesn't call her by a last name, and he doesn't say her name in the present because he doesn't know what her name is. He was aware that her name even her first name could have changed because any owner could have changed her name. Or after slavery ended, maybe she changed it herself. So he's looking for somebody named Betty. Now, the full names that he has are of former owners, and so who sold her and who she was sold to, because he's hoping here that somebody might recognize the names of those people. That's what I take from this, that these are the people with a presence. These people had a presence in the society, whereas his mother is just an enslaved woman, now former slave, named Betty. And so I found these just really powerful. I've got a couple more here, but I will read them. Mm-hmm.
Professor, may I ask a quick question? So,
Sure.
To your knowledge, to your understanding, were these ads edited or censored in any way? Or can we assume and trust that the voice we hear is in fact from the person placing the ad?
I think we know very little about how the ads were placed. But what I believe I know is that the information is coming from these people,
right.
But who wrote it down? Did Thornton Copeland, was he literate? I don't know.
Right.
Probably only about 10% of enslaved people were literate at the end of, and that's an estimate from Du Bois, and I don't know how he came up with that estimate really, because nobody was keeping track. It was outlawed in most states, but I have a whole book on people still trying to become literate during slavery despite the laws. So I think that these people, some of them may have written the ads themselves. Some of them may have gone down to the publisher, to the newspaper, and sort of dictated it. There were several, especially in the Christian Recorder, where they said, please contact Reverend so-and-so. It may be that Reverend so-and-so was literate and had written the ad. I don't know. So I offer different possibilities for how they reached the newspaper. But I do tend to believe the information that's in them. And also,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you. It seems to imply too a certain amount of either trust or desperation, right? This is a really intimate, personal, important thing, but they're trusting, whoever's placing the ad is trusting that the person on the other end is representing them accurately and taking it seriously.
Right. The person, in one of my classes, I taught at UNC Chapel Hill before I was at Penn, and I remember the student so clearly saying, the young Black man, and many of us in the room were talking about hope. And he said, I don't see hope. I think he may have used the language of desperation, but it was also despair. That this is just a last effort, you cannot really think that your mother's still alive. And that, the hope, I think, was that people in the Christian Recorder, people would say, ministers of the church, please read this ad to your congregation, because they knew that first of all, you might have one copy of a newspaper in a whole community. And then most people would not have been literate. So the idea was that in the churches, often in towns, you'd have a Methodist church and a Baptist church. And that was the gathering place on Sunday, but also on Wednesday night for service. They became schools. They served as schools. Before the Freedmen's Bureau set up schools, you had schools being held in these black churches. And so this is where people gathered. And if you could have this read aloud, maybe 50 people would hear it, maybe 100 people would hear it, and then those people would go into the community and circulate the information. And the hope was that somebody would know James French, or somebody had come across somebody named Betty who had come from Fauquier County. Yeah. So that's what their hope was, I think.
That's a really fantastic point. It actually addresses Lori's question about how, if the enslaved and now the freed blacks can't read, how would they know? Well, but you've answered it elegantly, which is, these became sort of a central time. And I suspect if you were trying to be found, you would probably go to these sessions and these meetings just hoping that you'd hear something about yourself.
Right. And I see a question about how successful people were. And I think I'll come to that towards the end, but I think it was very difficult to find somebody like Thornton Copeland trying to find his mother. There were people who were separated maybe miles apart, which during slavery was sometimes a world apart, because you were so restricted in your movement. But you might be able to go and find that person. Lots of runaway ads in the newspapers during slavery said, I think he's got a sister. I know he has a sister, and he may be headed to Memphis because he has a sister there. Or so a lot of people escaped trying to get to family members. So if they thought they knew where they were, they could go and find them. But I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So we've got these ads, and what I decided to do was to use them as the center for talking about family and about separation. So you've got these ads looking for people from whom people had been separated, but how did that separation happen in the first place? What were those circumstances? And so I wanted to frame it. Eventually I got it takes a long time. And as I said, I'm working on a book now. And so I'm back at this stage of trying to figure out, how do I tell, first of all, what's the story? How do I tell this story? How do I frame it? What are the chapters? What do I need to cover? What have other people already covered? That kind of thing. But I decided to do it, first of all, by thinking about family. And so I'll just tell you, at the beginning, I have 2 chapters. The first 2 chapters are about family relationships and separation within that context. The first one's about children being separated from parents and parents being separated from children. The second is about husbands and wives, which is the chapter that you have for reading. And then as I was working with the material, I thought, white people are present at these separations. What are white people thinking? And white people then became expansive. There's not one kind of white person there. So you've got people who are selling, people who are purchasing, people who are observing these transactions. You've got abolitionists coming from the North, wanting to see what's happening in the South. And so I do a chapter on that. Then I have a chapter on searching for family during slavery, a chapter on searching for family after slavery, and then a chapter on reunification, and then the epilogue that kind of takes us into the 20th century. So that's the outline that I came up with. And so this first is one of those documents, Andy, that you asked about, one of those, I don't know if it was a Shazam moment, but I was in the archive at the University of Virginia going through material, and there is a lot of material about Thomas Jefferson and his family and so forth, and you could go in there trying to find Black people and come out wanting to write a book about the Jeffersons or the Hemmings, because that's what's available. And I always tell my students that if you're going to do African American history, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, you've got to make that commitment. And I think that is also the case about teaching African American history, because it's so much easier to find other kinds of material. Some people who write about white women in an earlier period might have similar problems, except that you would, in many time periods, you'd find elite white women who would at least have left a diary or a journal or some letters. But when you're looking for people who are not the dominant people in the society, it's hard to find them. And therefore, you have to really say, I'm going to find these people somehow. And that really relates to this letter. So I was in the archives. If you've been in the archives, you know they tend to be cold because the material is very delicate, and they want to make sure that it's, you don't have humidity and heat and so forth. And you're also constantly under surveillance. I mean, somebody's sitting looking, and this was a big reading room with lots of glass, and I was one of maybe two people in there. And so they're either looking at you through their eyes or they're watching on a camera. And so, and at that archive, they give you loose leaf paper with holes punched in it so that you can't slip one of Thomas Jefferson's letters into your pile of material as you're leaving, and then they check. And so I'm in that kind of environment. And I read this letter and I heard myself gasp. So I give you that setting to say it's almost like a holy space, if you're a historian. And for me to make a sound in that space was very unusual for me. But when I read it, it was so powerful. So it's dated, is there a way for me to enlarge the slide so I can read it?
Unfortunately not. You can enlarge your screen, and our audience is seeing a full screen. So
okay, all right. Well, I'll do my best. So 1836, and it's a letter from, the name is cut off, but it's N.A. Hinkle. And he's writing to William Crowe, and he says, a friend of mine has a fine Black boy that is now in the market for sale. And I told him that I would write to you about him. He's about 12 years old, not tall for his age, but very stout. You had better come over and send some word immediately about him if you want to get him. And this made me gasp, because here he was talking about a child who was in the market. He was being sold, and he was being offered for sale. And this N.A. Hinkle is kind of a middleman, who probably would expect to get some money for having flagged this child. I didn't know, I don't have the name of this boy. I don't know if he had family still, or if he had already been sold from family, or they had been sold from him. I had so little information about him, but there was no way I would leave this document, and then having copied it and taken it with me, I knew I had to use it. I did research, and I found out some information about William Crowe, because again, it turns out he was a slave trader in Virginia. He purchased people, and this is very relevant for everything that we're talking about. Virginia started early as this colony, became rich. Certain people became rich from tobacco as a crop that was being exported to Europe, to England. But tobacco uses up the soil. And so people there's a lot of greed, people are expanding, they're taking over more and more. And after a while, tobacco was not as rich a crop as it had been. And so there's a point at which Virginia becomes an exporter of people. And you can see in the debates at the constitutional debates where some colonists were saying we need to stop slavery altogether. Others in South Carolina, Georgia are saying if you interfere with slavery in this Constitution, we will not be a part of the Union. You've got some people in Connecticut, New York saying let's just leave it alone. And one of the arguments for leaving it alone is that slavery is just going to die off on its own. And Virginia is exporting slaves, and if you interfere with the slave trade, the African slave trade, bringing people into the country to be enslaved, then Virginia will benefit because they will just set up basically a machine where they're selling people to the Deep South. And that prediction really came true. It's not that Virginia ever stopped enslaving people, but they sent a lot of people out of the state to once cotton took off as a crop, for instance. And so that's the context here, that William Crowe was purchasing people in Virginia, and he would have them chained up in his basement until he had enough people to make it worth his while to make the move to sell, to kind of march them into the South, the deeper South, for sale. And so I could find out something about him, but I don't know if he purchased this boy. As I said, I don't know anything about this boy other than the description that's in this letter. And so what I ultimately did was to begin chapter 1 with a discussion of this letter, and to say all the things I've just said that I don't know about him. I know something about William Crowe, but I'm going to write a chapter that tells you about other children who experienced separation. And there, I don't have any children speaking to me directly, but I have adults who wrote slave narratives, for instance, who say, I remember when I was a boy of 7 being sold, or my mother being taken away, and describing in detail how the mother was just on the ground and begging the slave trader to let her keep some of her children, begging a purchaser, for instance, please buy me and at least one of my children so I get to keep some of them. And so through talking about separation of children, you also get a sense of separation of how it affected parents. There's somebody who talks about his father. He doesn't use the language of depression, of course, but he says, his father, so his mother and his siblings were sold away. He was left with his father and his grandfather. And his father, who had been, this joyful man who would bring home little things for the children, just became more and more withdrawn and sullen, and I think eventually escaped. And so he was left to be raised by his grandfather. Children talked about, people talked about the experience as a child of early on, up until maybe about 8-7, not even realizing that they were enslaved. Some of them played in the yard with the white children from the owner's children. And then sometimes triggered by the sale of another child, they started to realize, so sale of another child, another big signal was when an owner was very sick. And the children would overhear the anxieties being expressed by the adults. Who's going to get whom, because in a will, the owner would have divided up property, right? Whether it was land or people, And with people, you're not necessarily handing them down to your heirs in family groupings. You're thinking about value. And so if a woman was, prime is this language that they use, and we'll see that in an ad later on. If you're a prime worker, meaning that you are a good, healthy worker, you're more valued than a child or an older person or somebody with a disability. And so they're not going to give one child all the prime people. And so a mother might have a 14-year-old son and a 15-year-old son. Those are not likely to go to the same person. And so the enslaved people knew this and would be talking about it, and the children are overhearing this. And so that's how they became, it was often through sale and separation that they even first became aware that they were enslaved. And then they said, so just going through the material, what I've seen is they didn't know they were enslaved. They figure this out. And then they figure out that being a slave means that you can be sold. And finally, that your parents were powerless to intervene. You go and you beg them. They are begging. You're seeing this display. And in the end, you're taken away or they're taken away. There were all kinds of ruses used, so somebody would purchase several children, for instance, put them on a carriage. They'd have an older Black woman, enslaved woman herself, who was probably facing family separation through that kind of transaction. And she's supposed to take care of them. They would give the children candy, so the kids don't really understand what's happening. The mother or the parents are very upset, but the kids have been placated. And then it's after they've traveled some distance and they realize that their mother's not coming, that their father's not coming, that maybe siblings aren't coming. So it's this slow awakening to their condition. And you see, at least I saw one person who said he became so desolate that he just kept crying and he wouldn't eat. And so then the person who had purchased him returned him to his previous owner, because he wasn't worth anything to him. He probably thought he would die from the sadness. So that's one of those documents that just meant a lot to me. And then I've got these kind of illustrations. Black people showed up in ads in newspapers from the 1600s to 1865 in different forms. So you've got these ads where they're offering people for sale. And then you've got runaway slave ads. And then, of course, you've got the ads where people eventually are looking for family members. So this is just an example of a child. So I talked about prime. Likely is another descriptor. So this is somebody who will, we're predicting will grow up to be a good slave physically, and is being offered for sale at a public auction. Okay, here's another one. This is actually two. Wanted to purchase a Negro girl, 10 or 12 years old. Inquire at this office. What are they doing with it? She could be a nurse. People use that language of nurse, and sometimes it's hard to get at what it means exactly, but young girls especially would take care of young white children. It could be for that. It could be we don't know. Then this is also offering for sale on a long credit a Negro girl and a child. So girl and boy often were used to describe adults. So it was fortunate for me that in the previous ad he said boy of 12 years old, because if I see boy in the sources, I cannot assume that boy means what we mean by boy. Boy could be a 35-year-old. Girl could be a 40-year-old. So Negro girl and child inquire at this office. Sometimes people did not want someone with a child because that meant somebody who had to be fed and taken care of in some way until you could become productive. But sometimes they wanted to know that a woman had had a child because they wanted to know that she was fertile and that again she would reproduce and those children would belong to the person to whom she belonged. This is another ad. Auction sale of Negroes, and this is in South Carolina, in Charleston, 1855. And what's interesting here is, I say groups of family groupings, and that's an assumption that I'm making, a presumption, which I wouldn't make in a book. Like I didn't use these. These are ads that I've come across in the last year, really. But because you can't, some of it you can't assume, but when you see Kate, age 23, with Sarah and Martha, and those are young children, it's quite likely that Kate is their mother. And you see some of those where those ages make sense. Rosanna, she's 40, and there's a 17, 16, and 12-year-old. Those, again. And what really is interesting, very interesting to me about this is, I don't know, if you're seeing full screen then you can probably make it out, but with Ralph and Unity, it's written by hand, withdrawn, and then with Rosanna, Paul, Dinah, James, withdrawn. And I think that may mean that one of those people was withdrawn from the sale. Which would then mean, if these were families, that somebody's not being sold with the rest of the family. So again, these are, I'm surmising here, I can't say for sure. The next ad is, again, I found these, I was doing research on this new book in South Carolina in 2019 now, I guess it is, and I came across these. And this one speaks to me because it shows the business nature of this enterprise. There were people who might sell one person. Sometimes if somebody died right there at the house, they would either, the heirs would get people, or they might have a sale right there at the house, or they would have a sale on the courthouse steps. But then you also had these business places like Ryan's Mart, which if you go to Charleston now, I've taken students there, it's now a museum. And so it's a place where people were being sold on a regular basis. And in Charleston, at first, they used to sell people on the street. In Washington, D.C., they would sell people on the street. So you've got abolitionists saying, my God, what a shame that with, at the corner of 10th and Pennsylvania, they're selling people right there in public. And as it happens, in another life, I was a lawyer, and my first job out of law school was at the Department of Justice that runs between 9th and 10th on Pennsylvania Avenue. And so when I saw that, it's just like, I know that place. It didn't look the way that I know it to look, but they were selling people on the street. And with the pressures of the abolition movement, you see them moving people in off the street so that now you can't just pass by and see this happening. And so they had these indoor marts in Charleston. And then you see the conditions here: 1/2 cash balanced by bond, bearing interest from day of sale, payable. It sounds like, what do you call that? When there's a commercial and then they give the fine print and they're talking very fast, right? So they're telling you, there's word for that, I can't think of what it is, but they're telling you here to be secured, you can be secured by a mortgage of the Negroes and approved personal security. So purchasers to pay for papers. So people could be mortgaged. You see documents for insuring enslaved people. They were very valuable property. And I know that sometimes people are offended by the use of these terms like owner and property, but I think that the farther we get from using those words, the farther we get from an understanding of what slavery was about, and an understanding of how bound these people were, and what a driving force they were in the economy of the United States. So that you've got banks, you've got insurance companies, you've got lawyers, you've got traders. People the old time historians used to say, oh, the traders were despised and they were shunned from decent society in the South. And then other people have come and said, no, they weren't. They were very much a part of society. They were not shunned. They were part of the engine that drove the economic growth of the South, but also the North. And by the way, these people are being sold as a gang of 25 Sea Island cotton and rice Negroes. So in South Carolina, rice was the first real cash crop. In Virginia, it was tobacco. In South Carolina, they tried indigo. They were, you had enslaved people as cowboys because they were raising cattle. Rice is the thing that really took the colony into sort of economic well-being, and then cotton, especially Sea Island cotton that they're advertising, which is a kind of the top quality cotton that was grown in the U.S. And after rice took off as a cash crop, they started looking for people from the rice coast in Africa, so places under Sierra Leone now, other places on the West Coast, where people had experience growing rice, because according to Peter Wood, who's a historian who's now retired from Duke, it was because some whites brought rice into the colony, but they didn't know how to grow it. Some enslaved people had experience growing rice. They're growing rice in their provision grounds, because in South Carolina, a lot of people had to raise their own crops. So in addition to working for the owners, they had to feed themselves just to a large extent, and they were having success with rice. And so then you start to see ads that say, we're bringing in a shipload of Negroes from the rice coast, and so advertising their skills, basically.
Professor, before you move on, I wonder if I can ask a couple of questions, in particular about the ads and the newspaper documents and sources that you've shared. There's been a couple of questions from our audience about where you find these things. Just as a professional historian, of course, you've got the time and the expertise to go sit in the Taylor room at Alderman and go through the microfiche, but where would you find documents like this now, particularly online? Do you use newspapers.com? Do you use the National Archives? Where is the go-to place?
Okay, so I use this book that I'm working on is the first I'm using newspapers.com, because it just wasn't that helpful for me before, but it is a treasure trove because I'm writing about violence and about murder, and of course that's something that newspapers covered and cover. So newspapers.com has been helpful to me. The Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, awesome. I used to take my students there for our research seminars, but they have been digitizing a lot of material. And they had a conference about 9 years ago. I was still there, and really made a commitment to digitizing. Actually, my advisor, Glenda Gilmore, challenged them and said, this is a Jim Crow archive created in Jim Crow times, and it's time to free it from that. And so they made digitizing collections that have anything about African Americans in them a priority. And so most of the collections are, of course, by well-off white people, usually white men, but you'll see some collections with journals, as I said, from white women. And so if they're talking about slave insurrection or about the sale of people, or the bills of sale, that kind of thing, anything related to slavery. You'll find that in those collections. And so if you go to Southern Historical Collection, and then they'll have a page where you can, they say search this collection. And basically it's a finding aid that if you put in arson or slave and murder, which is a search term that I've used, search slave and murder, it will come up with collections that have those terms. And if you're lucky, some of those items have been digitized. Others, have not. But you can also register with them, and then you can request documents. So that's a really good place. State archives are really, they vary, but I have now been to state archives in Virginia, North Carolina, so in Richmond, in Raleigh, in Columbia, South Carolina, in Atlanta, Georgia, in Jackson, Mississippi, usually at the state capitol, and in Montgomery, Alabama. And so they will have material that are local to them. I'm looking, they've been helpful to me because I've been looking for court cases. And so court cases would be housed in those places, but they have all kinds of other documents. And when you go there, you'll see people who are doing genealogical research. So the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I've used, and also in Atlanta. So they have, I don't know, there's probably something in California. I don't know exactly where they have, other centers, but so those are places.
But what's helpful though, Professor, is what you're doing tonight, because for most of us, without the expertise and the training and the skills that you have to go into literally 1.5 million documents and find the right ones and ask the right questions, what you've been able to do is curate a set of them to tell this story for us tonight. I'm curious, do you use the primary sources, the ads that you've shared so far? Do you use these in your teaching, in your classroom?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the choices I made in the book was in the chapter on the search after slavery. I have, I think, about 15 or 20 pages of ads because I just wanted people to have them. And then, so I do use them in teaching. I'm a quilter. I made a quilt when I was in grad school, so before I even really started this book. And it has lots of images. So the Emancipation Proclamation, music, Negro spirituals, and it's got some of the ads. And I use that in a couple of my classes, the African American History course, survey course, the research seminars, on the very first day of class. And so anybody could do this, right? You don't have to have a quilt. It could be any collection of documents. And I have the students go up in groups and pick a document, and then go back and talk about it, and then we have a discussion about it. And I do it on the first day because I want students to know that when they come into the classroom, they already bring skills and knowledge. I'm not the one up front who has all the information and all the skills. They already know how to read. They know how to analyze. They know how to make connections. And we'll learn more of how to do that, and they'll get more information with which to make those kinds of connections. But on the first day, they know that they can do this, and it's a very vibrant conversation because two people might look at Thornton Copeland's ad and come out with different interpretations of it.
That's really a great point, and thank you for saying that. As the moderator, I have the unfortunate job of keeping us on time, which means I'm here to remind us we've got about 20 minutes, a little over 20 minutes. So
okay.
I know we'll have some more questions, but why don't we go to move through the letters now, and I'll keep watching for more questions.
Okay, so as I go, I'll talk about where I got them. So this one this letter is one of those. This was a Shazam moment, and I found it on microfilm at UNC. There's this collection. People do work that I would never do that I value so highly. So somebody had people going to all these different plantations and collecting material and microfilming it, plantations and archives. And so it's on microfilm. So I came across this on microfilm. I don't even know how. I was just going. I didn't have a finding aid or anything. And it's a letter from an enslaved man to an enslaved woman. And I had, as I said, my first book, my dissertation book, was on literacy during slavery. And I think I had thought about literacy in terms of political action and mobilization and that kind of thing. That's what I was seeing. This letter showed me something different. And I'll go through very quickly. So the detail, I wanted you to have a piece of the document, but it's so hard to read. By the way, I make my students read some of these documents because cursive is so hard and almost impossible for them. But I think if we don't teach them how to read it, then they become hieroglyphics. You know what I mean? Like hieroglyphics. We just won't have access to this kind of information. So he's writing to his former owner. He says, "Dear friend, after a tender of my respects to you and your mother and all the rest of the family, etc., I pen you these few lines to inform." And this is what an enslaved person had to go through, right? He says, "Give my respects and love to Melinda, my former wife. Melinda, I wish to know how many children you have and who you have got for a husband. And if there is anything in my power that I can do for you, let me know, and I will do it." And then he said, "I married a very fine-looking yellow girl." And I always have to ask if people know what that means, a yellow girl. And it means a light-skinned Black woman, right? "I thought that if I could enjoy myself as well as I did with you, but it was a mistake. We lived." So he's writing to his former wife. I had never imagined finding a letter like this. And I tell my students in the research seminars, create a wish list. And part of their process of doing their proposal for their papers, what's your wish list? What would you like to find? What kind of document would you just love to find? This was never on my wish list because I just had not imagined it to exist. That here was an enslaved man writing a love letter to his former wife. And, in the book, I explained they could not be legally married, but many people considered themselves married. They could not be legally married because marriage is a contract, and they were not considered people who could enter into contracts. And what would happen if you're married and you have certain responsibilities to your husband, to your wife, an owner can come and break that up at any moment, can sell you, can separate you, and so forth. And from reading the letter very closely, I realized that he had probably been sold, or maybe not sold. I think a white family divided a plantation and took some people with them to, I can't even remember. He was in Mississippi. And I think she was in another part of Mississippi. I'm not remembering now. And that happened. And I have illustrations of cases of that in that same chapter 2, where some people, one son goes off and he takes 100 people with him, and another son stays behind. And so I think that division happened in this family. And so he's in Osaka, Mississippi, and he's referencing other people who Melinda knows, so other people who had been on that plantation with them before. And so here I have a transcription of the full letter. And one of the things that was very important to me, because if I see a letter that purports to be from an enslaved person, I need some clues to tell me that this is from that person. I can't assume, right? And so he says, I want to know how the crops are. They're good. Nothing more at present. You must excuse my bad writing and spelling. And so for somebody who had worked on literacy, I mean, this letter is such a prize to me. Why is he writing to her? It says addressed to Mr. Alec Ferrer by hand. So what I've figured out is that I think the people who owned John Beck, somebody was traveling back to see family at the other plantation and was willing to take this letter, which means that person likely knew that he was literate, right? But he's got to, I skipped over the beginning where he's sort of paying his respects and so forth. You have to do that because at some point he says, I hope you will read this letter to Melinda. So the letter ends up in the archive because it's in the papers of the first Melinda's owner. So we don't know if he read it to Melinda. We don't know. But here is this man who sat down and wrote this letter, and that was just stunning to me. This one is, I won't go through it, but this is one of those family movement situations where a family slave owner in North Carolina from Chowan County was purchasing land and moving to Mississippi. Again, Upper South, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, tobacco land is drying up, and they're going in search of land where cotton is now king. And they at the same time, when I talk about this family, I also found a document written by one of their descendants who was doing family history, and she basically says they were purchasing land on, I think it was Choctaw land. So they're moving Native people out of Georgia, out of Mississippi, out of Alabama, and taking over that land. And they're taking enslaved Africans and, well, by now African Americans, to cut down the trees and till the soil and create a working plantation that they hope will make them wealthy. And so he sent, his name's Brownrigg, and he sent 100 people, and they're walking from Chowan County down across the mountains going south. And so he sent with his sister and her husband. And then he said he would bring the other people with him, the other enslaved people with him when he came in the spring. Well, he shows up in the spring, and from what I can tell, well, he says the slaves are very upset with him, and he does not seem to have shown up with any enslaved people. So they realized that it had been a ruse. But basically, these letters, his sister allowed some of the enslaved people to dictate messages to their family members. So here is Rose writing to her husband, Hardy, and saying, I write to let you know that I think of you often and wish to see you very bad. I have good health and the children are too, but feel hard a little. But I see so many sights and have so many good things. I wish you all had some of them. I hope yet to see you. Maria joins me in love and all friends. And you can tell from some of these notes that they dictated that some of their families had been split. So here's Rose writing to her husband. Sometimes the person dictating a message. Sometimes the person who was on the road had some of the children with him or her, and the others were with the person who had been left behind. So you see a family divided in that way, even though they were all owned by the same people, because often these separations happened because there were different owners, especially with husbands and wives. I went in search, as I said, of white people. What are they thinking? What are they doing? And there's a range, and you really have to read that chapter. I mentioned some of that range, abolitionists who are appalled, tourists. I mean, these slave auctions were tourist sites, people going from the north, and you see somebody on a train saying, I saw my first Negroes today, or my first slaves today. And then they see a sign that says there'll be a slave auction, and they go to the auction, and they're looking at the people who are being sold, and they are forming a perspective about how that person feels. And sometimes they say, boy, somebody was really upset. Other times they say, oh, they seem quite calm, no problem. A very interesting person is Thomas Chaplin, and his journal is just a rich source. And this is something that I have seen, the actual handwritten journal at the archive in Charleston, but I think it's the Charleston, South Carolina Historical Society, and it's now part of College of Charleston. So I've seen the handwritten, but there's a book called Tombee, Tombee, and it's Rosengarten, and he transcribed the journal. So he's got a really nice introduction with lots of information about the family, and then the transcription of the entries that Thomas Chaplin made. And very briefly, Thomas Chaplin inherited people when he was about 17. His father died and left him. In 1845, he had about 70 people he owned, and he was in debt, as slave owners often were. And the sheriff was going to come and seize some of the slaves to sell them to pay off his debts, because you could do that. You know, maybe he had mortgaged some of those people, right? And so he decided to do a workaround and send people to Charleston and sell them, have them sold on his behalf, and then pay off the debt, so that way he'd be in a better position. And he basically selects out 10 people and he sends them. And so here he's saying, I never thought I'd be driven to this. Nothing can be more mortifying and grieving to a man than to select out some of his Negroes to be sold. You know not to whom or how they will be treated by their new owners, and Negroes that you find no fault with. So one of my questions going into this chapter was, what the white people who saw these separations, who were involved in these separations, who were a part of this, who were observing, what were they thinking? What did any of them care about the people? Did they think that those people had feelings? What were they saying? And so for the most part, you get people who just think politically and morally, this is horrible. Then you have people who say, oh, the Negroes don't seem to mind at all. And then you've got a guy like Thomas Chaplin who says, this is terrible. You know, so he's feeling sorry for himself, because it's partly mortifying because he's not exhibiting mastery. You know, he's not in charge of his affairs the way that he should be. But he's also feeling badly about selling these people. And so he tells you the names of the people, so he knows these people. He only owns 70. Some people own 400, 900, you know. I can't express my feelings on seeing so many faithful Negroes going away. I hope I will benefit by it. The Negroes did not incline to get off. There was a problem with the boat and the weather, but apparently quite willing and in good spirits, particularly Prince and Paul. I hope they will bring a good price in Charleston. So on the one hand, he's concerned about them. On the other hand, he says some of them don't seem to mind at all. And maybe Prince and Paul were glad to get away. Maybe they thought, you know, things would be better somewhere else. And then he talks about the price. Bring a good price, and I hope I won't have to sell anymore. He stays away when they're leaving, and then he says the Negroes at home are quite disconsolate, but this will soon blow over, so they may see their children again in time. So he was aware that the people who had been left behind, he knew who, you know, when he sold Paul, he knew who Paul's mother was, or Paul's sister, or Paul's other relative, and so the people left behind are disconsolate, but it will blow over. And then, it's not on the slide, but I wanted to share this. He went back. So during the Civil War, the Union took over the Sea Islands. He lived on St. Helena's Island off South Carolina. The Union got there, Union forces got there, white people fled, When he was leaving, he said to one of the men he owned, "Take care of things for me. Watch out for me till I come back." He gets back after the war. Every Black person had left. And so he goes back, and I saw this myself in the archives. It's a handwritten journal. The pages are full. And so he wrote on the side of the page, note to 4th and 5th of May, it was a trying thing then, but could I or anyone have foreseen how things would be 19 years after, when every Negro was set free by, quote, force of war, end quote? I and everyone else would have gladly put them all in their pockets. Besides, I would not have felt bad about it, for in truth, the Negroes did not care as much about us as we did for them. And so put them all in their pockets. So he's saying, he wrote the journal in 1845. He's saying now 19 years later, all of them have left. They've been freed and they have left. And if we had known, we slave owners had known that this would happen, we would have gladly put them in our pockets, meaning we would have cashed out, we would have sold them. And he says, and I wouldn't have felt bad about it. So he felt bad about it in 1845 when he wrote these entries. But now he says, I wouldn't have felt bad about it because they did not care as much about us as we did for them. And so you've got this kind of, I can't, the word just slipped my mind, but where he seems to have really believed that when he said to that man, watch out for me, take care of everything for me, that man would stay there. And those other people would stay there, and they would keep farming his land and waiting for him to come back. And he's shocked and upset that now he has nothing. The union, I think, had taken over his property. He became a school teacher, right? And I think he was teaching in a freedmen's school. So for, a white Southern man to teach in a freedmen's school, that means he had really fallen. And it's because he no longer owned people who would make him at least make money, even if he was going to lose the money. Well, into this chapter where I'm looking at, I have to say, I center Black people in my work. I'm very interested in what's happening to African Americans. What were their experiences in this book? What were their emotions? How did they deal with separation, that kind of thing? And I have this chapter where I just had to look at white people and what they were thinking and what they were feeling. But I couldn't get to the end. I could not get to the end of the chapter without having a Black person speak. And so that comes in through Bethany Veeney, who was enslaved in Virginia and was sent. Her husband had escaped. He wanted her to go with him. She said, no, I don't know any other life. And so she stayed, but then now she was being sold away from her daughter. And so she's in the auction house, in the jail where they would hold people until they took them in for auction. And she overheard the jailer's daughter singing this song, How Firm a Foundation, when through deep waters I go, how God will help you, and if he helps other people, he will help me. And she got on the auction block, so she's got this Christian hymn in her mind, and she used to go to the Methodist services with her owner's cousin or something like that. But she had also gone to an old woman, she said, who had given her something to put under her tongue. And the thing that she put under her tongue turned her tongue, I think it was blue. And so when they examined her on the auction block, they did not want anything to do with her. And so that's how she defeated the sale. But I think that, people often ask, and students ask, how could Black people adopt this religion that was used to oppress them? And I think when you come across a hymn like this, you can see the appeal that Christianity had to people, that there's a better way. And that, again, is a whole other discussion. But a lot of the enslaved people who wrote about this say the Christianity that was being practiced by owners was not real Christianity. That was not the true Christianity. But people found solace in a hymn like this, or in passages in the Bible that owners didn't want them to see, about equality of all people. And so, yeah, that's a whole discussion. Quickly, that got distorted, but this is a letter from Violet Lester, and she was looking for her daughter. She wrote, I don't know if this is her handwriting or not, but she sent a letter to her former owner. She was in Georgia, and writing back to a former owner with, it sounds like it's a woman with whom she had grown up. So they had played in the yard together, and she's kind of calling on that friendship, that old friendship. And she goes through a litany of relationships and, send my love to your mother and so on. And then she gets to what I think is the point of her letter. She says, I wish to know what has ever become of my precious little girl. I left her in Goldsboro with Mr. Walker, and I have not heard from her since. And Walker said he was going to carry her to Rockingham and give her to his sister. And I want to know whether he did or no. And I do wish to see her very much. And she basically had been sold numerous times since Miss Patsy is who she's writing to, since Miss Patsy's family had sold her. And she tells you where she was sold to, and then where, and then where. And now she was in Georgia, and she said her owner in Georgia said that he would be willing to purchase her child for her. And so she's trying to find out where the child is and whether she'd be able to get her. And that really inspired me. This is the cover of Help Me to Find My People. This is a quilt that I made for the cover, and you can see there's a child's dress, but there's no child. There's no little girl there. And then I traced over the handwriting in the letter from Violet Lester, where it says, what I just read about, I wish to know what has ever become of my precious little girl. So people searched during slavery. They searched after slavery with the ads. They walked to try to find family members. They wrote letters or had letters written and sent to the Freedmen's Bureau. So somebody in Virginia writes to the Freedmen's Bureau in New Orleans saying, my daughter was sold in this year. Her name was such and such. I think the trader was such and such. And the Freedmen's Bureau agent actually went out to the trader, or former trader by then, who said, I don't know, I sold a lot of people. I didn't keep any records. If you want to know, you need to talk to the people in Virginia. And basically, that's one of the big issues. Nobody was keeping track of these people. After slavery, there are no records that will tell you that John was sold to Michael, was sold to Susan, and lived in this place. There are no records of. So you'll see records like the one where people are being offered for sale, and their name is there, their first name is there, but we don't know a last name. We don't have much information about these people. And so it was very hard, I think, to find family members, unless, as I said, you already had a sense of where the person was. And I've seen documents where people said, this one man in particular said he had walked from the reporter. This person wrote for The Nation magazine, and he met the man in North Carolina, and he said he had walked from Georgia to get back. And people, the black people had been very helpful to him. He said the white people he tried to avoid, but he was going back to his hometown in North Carolina, hoping that his family members were still there. Of course, when you get there, some of them may have been there, some of them may have been sold away. It was just hard to know what the situation would be. And so people kept searching. The ads kept running until 1903 is the last one that I found, which is quite remarkable, that, as I said, Thornton Copeland was looking for his mother 22 years after he had been separated from her. That was 1866. People kept looking until 1903, hoping that somebody was still alive, and they would give you the name. So the title of the book, Help Me to Find My People, that language was used in some of those, especially the later ads. Help me to find my people. I'm looking for my kinfolk. I'm looking for my people. And then in the epilogue of the book, I talk about the time comes when neither the searcher nor the searched for would still be alive. So if you had been enslaved, I mean, the people who were interviewed in the 1930s who had been enslaved, but a lot of those people would have already died, and the people they were looking for probably would have already died. And so you see African Americans then memorializing people in different ways. And so I found this, it's a sack, it's a cotton sack, and it's at the Middleton Place plantation in South Carolina. I used to teach a course called Slavery in South Carolina when I was at UNC, and we would go down to Charleston for a week and just visit lots of places. And so they had this in a glass case one time when I went for my pre-class visit. And it's embroidered, the sack is embroidered, and it says, my great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it'd be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, and it's signed by Ruth Middleton in 1921. And so this is a story that had been passed down in the family, and Ruth Middleton memorialized it in this sack, in this embroidery. And I think they're still trying to get the provenance of this. You know, it ended up at Middleton Place because of the name Middleton, but they're not really sure where Rose had been enslaved. So I go through the 20th century looking at the other ways in which African Americans commemorate the people lost in slavery or family members who had been enslaved. And so going from the 1920s and the 1930s, you get people being interviewed by the Works Progress Administration, and some of them do kind of a genealogy of separation. They tell you who was lost. You know, my mother went to Mississippi, but my grandmother didn't go with her. And you get Roots airing in 1977, and then lots of people looking for family members, reunions, that kind of thing. And I end the book with this image of Charlie Crump, and I didn't talk about reunification. Very hard to find people. When they did find people, sometimes there were all kinds of complications. You had lost your husband, now you're married again. The old husband comes back, what decision do you make? And people made different decisions in different circumstances. Children, father comes back, they're hiding under the bed because they don't recognize this person. And so those, how do you know? How do you identify somebody if you had been separated for a long time and now you're siblings and now you're grown up? How do you know that's your brother? You know, people told him, he looks just like you, and he's missing a thumb. And so the brother knew that his brother had lost a thumb when they were children, and so he goes and he finds him. But I end the book with Charlie Crump. He's not mentioned in the book at all. I don't think I even labeled the photograph, but it's an important photograph to me. This was taken in 1937 in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he's with his granddaughter. And the significance of this to me is that Charlie Crump had survived slavery. He gave a 2-page interview about what that had been like. And he had survived it. And he now had this grandchild, which means he had had children and now he had a grandchild, and that some people did survive it. Some people maintained families throughout slavery. Not everybody was separated, but it was a profound part of the experience because it could happen at any time, and it did happen so often. So Charlie Crump for me is a statement about survival and going on. And I think that's it.
Well, the good news is it's not it, only because just as I asked you at the start of tonight's session, if you had some Shazam moments, I think you've now shared some Shazam moments with our audience, because being able to hear the humanity and really trace that human relationship through the tragedy of slavery has been very, very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us tonight, Professor Heather Williams.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and thanks.
I want to thank everybody in our audience for joining us tonight. I hope you do follow the National Humanities Center on our social media feeds for upcoming opportunities and activities that we do for educators at all levels. That does include our webinar series, which resumes tomorrow night. Under 24 hours, we'll be turning this around. It's a great day to play to. On April the 7th, tomorrow, Wednesday, we'll be joined by Michelle Zimmerman to discuss the role of the humanities in understanding the impact of artificial intelligence in our teaching and learning. Please do join us tomorrow night, and for one of the remaining 7 sessions. Our last session is scheduled for early May. I hope to see many of you here between now and then. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We'll see you next time at the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.